By the time Penny Hollister was 28, she'd learned that nobody was coming to save her. So she'd stopped waiting and started surviving. She worked the breakfast shift at a diner in Millvale and scrubbed office floors until 2 in the morning, and every dollar scraped together went toward rent she could barely cover, and an inhaler her 6-year-old daughter couldn't breathe without. Her ex had left her nothing but debt, and by the time Penny Hollister was 28, she'd learned that nobody was coming to save her. So she'd stopped waiting and started surviving. She worked the breakfast shift at a diner in Millvale and scrubbed office floors until 2 in the morning, and every dollar scraped together went toward rent she could barely cover, and an inhaler her 6-year-old daughter couldn't breathe without. Her ex had left her nothing but debt and a leaking house with an old storm cellar out back, and the world had a way of reminding her, every single day, that a tired woman in a stained uniform didn't matter to anyone. That's why, when she heard something clawing at the cellar door during a hailstorm one night, she almost didn't open it. But Penny had never once been able to walk past someone who was hurting, and on the other side of that door was a teenage girl, bleeding from her shoulder, soaked and shaking, begging her not to call the police. Most people would have slammed the door and locked it twice. Penny pulled her inside, pressed a towel to the wound, and hid her in the dark. What she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly have known, was that the trembling girl in her arms was Calla Vance, the baby sister of Griffin Vance, the most feared crime boss in western Pennsylvania, a man who'd buried his father at 19, watched his mother fade away years later, and built an empire out of fear ever since. She didn't know that the polite men knocking on her door minutes later worked for someone who wouldn't think twice about burning her whole street to the ground to find that girl. And she had no idea that the moment she chose to protect a stranger's child, she'd placed herself and her own little girl directly between a ruthless king and the war that was coming for him. So before this single mother's quiet act of kindness drags her into a world of money, blood, and a dangerous man who's forgotten how to be human, do me a favor. If a story about courage and the people the world overlooks is something you believe in, hit that like button. Share this with someone who needs to hear it tonight, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss what happens next. Now let's go back to the night the storm rolled in, and the knock that changed everything. Hail beat against the tin roof like thousands of small fists demanding to be let inside, and under the dim beam of a flashlight in the storm cellar, Penny Hollister knelt on the freezing concrete beside the girl who was trembling in waves. Her hand still pressed an old bath towel tightly against the girl's left shoulder, where blood had seeped through the cloth in a dark stain that kept spreading before finally slowing, and she silently thanked all those years of waiting tables in a diner for teaching her how to keep her hands from shaking, even when panic was tearing through her chest. The girl looked barely older than a child, her face pale and speckled with mud, her wet brown hair plastered to her forehead, her eyes darting again and again toward the cellar door, as if the darkness outside were still chasing her. Penny lowered her voice to a whisper, the same voice she used to soothe her daughter whenever thunder frightened her, and told the girl she was safe now, that no one knew this place, that Penny would not let anyone hurt her again. The girl swallowed hard, her lips moving for a long time before she finally managed to force out a name, Calla. Only that, no last name, not a single explanation. And when Penny gently asked where her family was so she could call them, those eyes immediately darkened with suspicion, and the girl only shook her head, begging her not to call anyone, not the police, not anyone at all. There was something in that absolute terror that made Penny falter, a fear too vast for an ordinary accident. The fear of someone who knew exactly who was hunting her, and for the first time since opening the cellar door, a chill ran down her spine, not because of the rain, but because she was beginning to understand that she had just stepped into something far beyond the reach of a woman, used only to worrying over every electric bill. Penny pushed the thought aside, because right now the only thing that mattered was stopping the bleeding and keeping the girl warm. So she took off her old frayed quilted coat and draped over Calla, pulled out the cheap first aid kit she had bought at the corner drugstore, and with quick hands cleaned and bandaged the wound with every bit of care she had, gently, as if she were tending to her own daughter. The girl hissed softly from the pain, her fingers digging into Penny's wrist, and Penny only squeezed back an answer, whispering that she was right there, that Calla could hold on to her if she needed to, until the girl's ragged breathing gradually settled into tired, uneven rhythms. Just then, from the creaking wooden stairs leading up into the house, a sleepy child's voice drifted down, calling for her mother, and Penny's heart clenched. Bertie, her 6-year-old daughter, stood on the top step, hugging her worn stuffed animal, her little eyes narrowed against the light, her mouth round with surprise as she stared at the stranger lying in the cellar. Penny hurried to her feet, her knees cracking from kneeling too long, and she climbed the stairs to reach her child before Bertie could ask another question, pulling her into her arms and rubbing her back in the familiar rhythm. She told Bertie that it was only one of her mother's friends who was sick and had come to shelter there because the storm outside was so bad, that she should be a good girl and go back to bed, and by morning everything would be all right. Bertie yawned, nodded, believing her mother the way all children do, and let Penny lead her upstairs, tuck her under the warm blankets, kiss her forehead, and stay until her breathing turned steady again. When Penny returned to the cellar, Calla had fallen asleep from exhaustion, and Penny sat down on the lowest stair, wrapped her arms around her knees, and listened to the hail outside beginning to thin. In that quiet moment, the truth truly crashed down over her, that she had just hidden a hunted stranger beneath the same roof where her daughter slept, that she had no idea what she was standing against, and that tomorrow, when the sun rose, she would have to face the price of the kindness she had just given. She did not know why she had opened that door. She only knew that if she had to choose again, she would still open it. The hail had only just fallen silent when another sound cut through the quiet. 3 slow knocks on the door, steady, polite, and somehow far colder to Penny's spine than if someone had pounded with both fists, because only people certain of their own power knocked that calmly at 2 o'clock in the morning. Penny went rigid on the stairs, her heart pounding up into her throat, and she quickly bent down to warn Calla with lips that barely made a sound, telling her not to move, not to make a single noise. Then she turned off the flashlight, pulled an old tarp loosely over the girl, and went upstairs, closing the cellar door behind her. She smoothed down her wrinkled nightgown, drew in a deep breath, and when she opened the front door, she had already placed on her face the weary, sleepy look of someone who had just been woken, a mask she had practiced again and again for years. On the porch stood 2 men in dark, sharply tailored coats, their hair neat, their polished leather shoes without a single drop of mud on them, though the whole neighborhood had just been swallowed by a storm. And it was that impossible cleanliness that made Penny understand at once that they were not from around here. The taller man smiled, a smile so carefully carved it never reached his eyes, apologized for disturbing her at such a late hour, then asked in a courteous voice whether she had happened to see a young girl wandering around that evening, a friend of their family, someone who had been in a car accident and was panicking, who might have run blindly into someone's yard. Penny let her face crease with honest confusion. She scratched her head, gave one long obvious yawn, and answered that she had not seen anyone, that she had just walked through the door from her late shift a short while ago, and had barely fallen asleep, and that with a storm like tonight's, she would not have stepped outside even in a dream. She lied so smoothly that even she was briefly startled by it, but it was a skill she had paid dearly to learn, years of learning how to keep her voice calm. When her former husband came home reeking of liquor, and she had to tell the neighbors that everything was fine, the times when creditors crowded her doorway and she smiled as she promised she would pay them for certain that month. Life had trained her to lie in order to survive, without letting her face change at all. The man tilted his head and studied her, his eyes sliding past her shoulder into the dark house, pausing on the wooden staircase, and for one breathless stretch of time Penny thought her heart might stop, but she stayed perfectly still, one hand braced on the doorframe, her expression untouched by worry, only an exhausted mother, whose rare sleep had been disturbed. He asked whether she would mind if they looked around the backyard for a moment, and Penny only shrugged and said her back gate was locked, and she had no idea where she had put the key. But if they wanted, they were welcome to go around the outside and look, though she was afraid all they would find was mud and trash. It was that careless indifference, the attitude of someone with nothing to hide, that finally made the 2 men believe her. The taller one nodded, thanked her for cooperating, placed a plain white business card in her hand, with nothing but a phone number printed on it, and told her that if she saw anything unusual, she should call that number and there would be a reward. Then both men turned and stepped down from the porch, blending into the wet darkness as silently as they had arrived. Penny closed the door, slid the bolt into place, and stood with her back against it for a long time, her legs shaking so badly that she had to slide down to the floor and sit there, gripping the card in her damp palm. When she was calm enough to return to the cellar and turn the flashlight back on, she found Calla curled tightly in the dark corner, 2 streams of tears slipping silently down her young face, and the girl whispered through choked sobs that she was sorry, having never thought anyone would risk themselves for her like that, thanking Penny over and over again. Penny stepped toward her, pulled the girl into her arms, and in the darkness of the cellar, she softly said it was all right, that they were gone now. But even as she spoke those words, deep inside Penny knew a cold truth with perfect clarity, that people like that never truly went away, and this was only the beginning. Near dawn, Calla began to burn with fever, her skin hot beneath Penny's palm even though the air outside was still bitterly cold, and delirious words kept spilling from the girl's cracked lips in broken fragments that Penny had to lean close to hear. She called out a name, Griffin, again and again like a prayer, sometimes whispering it as if she were afraid someone might hear, sometimes crying it out in panic as if she were reaching for a hand that was not there, and Penny could only dip a cloth into a basin of cold water, wring it out, and lay it across the girl's forehead, murmuring that she was right there, that Calla should try to sleep, that someone named Griffin was surely looking for her. The name seemed to carry a strange power, because when Calla heard it, she softened a little. Her breathing grew less frantic, and when the fever eased slightly just as dawn began to break, she woke in a dazed, half-conscious state, her eyes barely open as she looked at the strange woman who had stayed awake beside her all night. Penny gave her a cup of warm water, supporting the back of her neck so she could drink in small sips, and in the gentlest voice she could manage, she asked who Griffin was, whether he was the person Calla wanted her to contact. Calla stayed silent for a long time, her eyes torn between fear and exhaustion, and at last she revealed part of the truth, enough to make Penny shiver, yet still missing the most important piece. She said Griffin was her brother, the only person she had left in the world, that bad people wanted to use her to force him to do what they wanted, that she had been put into a car, and everything after that was something she did not want to remember. She said she had managed to escape, had run through the rain, for she did not know how long, through streets she did not recognize, until she collapsed outside Penny's cellar door. But she still kept her last name hidden, omitting what her brother did for a living, or why the men hunting her were dressed so elegantly and carried themselves with such unnerving calm. And then, in the midst of her bone-deep exhaustion, with her guard slipping, the girl let one sentence fall that caught Penny's attention, saying that she should have stayed where he had hidden her, that he had told her over and over not to step outside under any circumstances. But she had not listened, and now all of this was her fault. Penny did not fully understand what those words meant, but she could feel inside them a burden of guilt far too heavy for a 19-year-old girl, the torment of someone who believed disaster had come because of her own recklessness. Penny only stroked the girl's hair, telling her that everyone her age had moments when they wanted freedom, that none of this was her fault, that the ones to blame were the people who had hurt her. Calla looked at her with eyes brimming with tears, as if it had been far too long since anyone had spoken to her with such kindness, and she was about to say something more when, from inside the soaked sneaker thrown in the corner of the cellar, a faint light blinked along with a soft vibration. It was a small hidden phone that even Penny had not known was there, and Calla lunged toward it, snatching it up with terror plain on her face. On the cracked screen was a message from an unnamed number, only a few cold words, but enough to make Penny's blood feel as if it had frozen when she read them over the girl's shoulder, saying that they knew she had not gone far, that every minute that passed meant more people would pay, and that for every hour she kept hiding, one more innocent person in this neighborhood would suffer the consequences. Calla began to shake violently, stammering that she had to leave right away, that she could not drag Penny and her little daughter into this, that she would rather go back out there, alone, than let the two of them be harmed because of her, and she tried to force herself to stand even though the fever made her sway and nearly fall. Penny held her tightly, pressed her back down, and in that moment she stood at the cruelest crossroads of her life, with her daughter's safety on one side, and a life begging to be allowed to live on the other. And she knew that no matter which path she chose, the painfully quiet life she had known would never return again. Penny had not even managed to persuade Calla to stay when outside. The gray dawn over Millvale was suddenly torn open by the low growl of several engines arriving at once, and when she lifted the curtain at the ground floor window and looked out, her heart clenched at the sight of her entire little street being sealed off. A convoy of glossy black sport utility vehicles, their windows so dark no one could see through them, glided silently into place and blocked both ends of the road, cutting off every exit like a tightening vise. And from those vehicles, men in dark suits stepped out one by one, spreading along the sidewalks with the cold precision of people who had done this many times before. What made Penny shiver more than anything was not their number, but the absolute silence that blanketed everything. No police sirens, no patrol cars, not a single sign of law enforcement, even though an entire residential block was being locked down in broad daylight, as if the force descending on this neighborhood held enough power to make the city's whole system of protection go blind and mute for a while. And it was in that moment Penny truly understood that she was trapped in the path of people beyond the reach of ordinary law. Calla crawled over to the window and glanced outside, and instead of growing more frightened, her face loosened with a strange mixture of relief and horror as she whispered that those were her brother's men, that Griffin had found her at last. The door of the vehicle in the middle of the convoy opened, and a man stepped out who seemed to thicken the very air around him. He was tall, wearing a long black overcoat made from the kind of expensive fabric that did not belong on a run-down working-class street like this one. His dark hair brushed neatly back to reveal a sharply cut face that looked as if it had been carved from stone, and he moved without hurry yet with unmistakable authority, each measured step carrying the assurance of a man who knew the world would always shift aside to make way for him. Penny had never seen anyone like him in real life, a man whose presence alone made the room around him feel heavy and hard to breathe in, and when his cold gray eyes swept across the front of her house, she had the sensation of being seen clear through to the bone. She quickly pulled Bertie, who had just been startled awake for the second time by the roar of the engines behind her, and stepped forward to open the front door, before any of those men could break it down. Because she understood that resistance was pointless, that the only way to protect her daughter was to appear cooperative. The man named Griffin climbed the steps, and when he ducked to fit through the low, narrow doorway of her little house, the contrast was almost absurd. A man made for mansions and power, standing inside a cramped living room with a worn upholstered sofa, a threadbare rug rubbed nearly bald, and the lingering smell of cheap coffee still hanging in the air. He let his gaze drift calmly around the small room, taking in every sign of poverty without showing emotion. Then his eyes settled on Penny, who stood there shielding her little girl, both hands clenched tight but her chin still lifted high. Behind him, through the open doorway, Penny caught sight of the other men still holding their positions out on the street, waiting for orders, and suddenly she realized something even more terrifying, that if this man had the power to freeze an entire neighborhood into silence, then the men who had hunted Calla the night before, men just as polished and composed, must command power no less formidable. And she, a single mother with nothing but her roughened hands, was standing squarely between two forces strong enough to crush her without anyone ever knowing. Griffin had not yet spoken a single word, but his eyes had already shifted from Penny toward the cellar, as if he knew exactly where his sister was, and in that suffocating silence, Penny could hear the pounding of her own heart like a desperate prayer. For the safety of the child pressed trembling behind her. Griffin Vance crossed the cramped living room toward the cellar door, and every cold movement in him carried the ruthless calculation that had become instinct, because for a man who had lived his whole life in his world, a witness who had seen too much, a woman who knew the faces of his men, who knew his sister was being hunted, was a danger to be dealt with cleanly, not a savior to be repaid. He gave a slight tilt of his head to signal the two men behind him, and Penny, though she did not fully understand the hidden rules of this world, still felt that icy killing intent in the way they closed in around her, in the emotionless eyes of the man looking at her as if she were a problem to be solved. She tightened her hold on Bertie's hand and took one step back. But she did not beg, did not cry. She only stood there, shielding her child with every scrap of dignity an exhausted mother could still gather. But when Griffin pulled open the cellar door and the dim light spilled downward, he stopped short, his tall body seeming to turn to stone on the top step. Down there, his sister was not lying in a cold pool of blood the way his worst fear had haunted him for days, but was tucked warmly beneath an old frayed quilted coat, her shoulder neatly and carefully bandaged, a freshly changed wet cloth resting on her forehead, with a basin of water, a cup of tea still warm, and every small sign that someone had stayed awake through the night, caring for her with a tenderness money could not buy. Calla looked up and saw him, then burst into tears and called his name, struggling to reach out her hand. And through her sobs, she told him in broken fragments that this woman had saved her, had hidden her from those men, had lied to protect her, though they did not know each other, that without her, Calla would not still be sitting here now. Griffin slowly turned his head to look at Penny, and this time something in those steel-gray eyes had changed. It was no longer the cold look reserved for a threat to be removed, but the bewilderment of a man of immense power, suddenly faced with something outside every calculation he had ever made, a selfless kindness he had never believed was real. While the air stretched tight as a wire, one of Griffin's men, older than the others, calm in bearing, with graying hair and eyes strangely gentle for his line of work, quietly moved closer to Bertie. The little girl was hiding behind her mother's legs, trembling and beginning to breathe too quickly from fear, and the man, whose name was Cormac, slowly lowered himself to one knee so he was level with her, softened his voice, and asked whether she liked teddy bears. Then, from the pocket of his expensive suit jacket, he took out a piece of candy and offered it to her with the warm smile of a grandfather. Bertie hesitated and looked to her mother for permission, and there was something in that stranger's sincere gentleness that softened even Penny, making her give a small nod for her daughter to accept it. Cormac spoke with the little girl for a few wandering moments about her stuffed animal, long enough for Bertie's panicked breathing to slow, long enough for the tears at the corners of her eyes to stop spilling, and among all the cold men who had poured into her home and shattered her morning, he was the only one who treated Penny and her child like human beings rather than obstacles. Penny gave him a silent look of gratitude, fixing in her heart the image of a kind man among wolves, never knowing that the trust she had just placed in him in this very moment would one day become the most painful knife ever driven into her back. And Griffin still stood there at the mouth of the cellar, his eyes moving back and forth between crying Zeester and the poor woman who had risked both her life and her daughter's to shelter a stranger. And for the first time in many years, the boss who was used to ordering deaths without blinking realized he had absolutely no idea what to do with a kindness like this. Once Cormac had carried Calla up from the cellar with careful arms, and Griffin's men began wiping away every trace of the night before. Griffin Vance turned back to face Penny in the cramped living room, and he reached inside his black overcoat to pull out a thick stack of cash, large bills bound neatly with a band, more money than Penny earned in an entire year of breaking her back between 2 shifts. He placed the stack on the rickety wooden table between them with a casual motion, the gesture of a man used to buying other people's consciences outright and never failing. Then in a low, even voice without a trace of warmth, he said this was payment for her silence, that she would forget his face, forget what she had seen, forget that his sister had ever set foot inside this house, and in return, she and her daughter would live peacefully as if nothing had ever happened. He added that with that money she could pay off her debts, move out of this shabby neighborhood, buy her daughter all the medicine she needed, and he looked at her with the absolute certainty of a man who knew no one in the world would refuse such a generous way out. Penny looked down at the stack of money lying on the table, where she still sat every night mending her uniform and spreading out the bills to count every dollar again and again and again, wondering which payment she would have to postpone that month. And for one brief moment her exhausted heart ached at the thought of everything that money could change. A warmer home for Bertie, nights no longer spent lying awake in fear of creditors knocking at the door, a life with a little less weight pressing down on it. But then she lifted her head, looked straight into the cold gray eyes of the powerful man standing before her, and pushed the money back toward him with her calloused fingertips, firmly and without the slightest tremble. She told him she had not saved that girl for money, that last night, when she pulled Calla into the cellar and pressed a towel against her wound. She had not known whose sister the girl was, had not thought of being paid a single cent. She had only done what any decent human being should do when they saw a life bleeding at their door. She told him to take his money back, that her silence was not a thing to be bought and sold, that if he was worried she would speak. Then she promised him, on the honor of a mother, that she would never say a word. Not because of that stack of money, but because she did not want that poor girl to face any more danger. A strange silence fell over the cramped room, and Griffin Vance stood frozen, as if he had just heard a language he had never known before. Because through all the years he had ruled by fear and money, he had watched countless people kneel for money, betray for money, kill for money, had grown used to the truth that every person had a price, and yet now the poorest woman he had ever met was pushing back toward him the very thing his entire world always craved, and she was doing it not with arrogance, but with a quiet dignity that left him unable to find a single word in answer. He looked at her for a long time, the assessing gaze of a man who always searched for lies in every heartbeat of the person before him. But in Penny he found no pretense at all, only naked truth, and a stubborn kindness so fierce it felt almost like a challenge to everything he had believed about human nature. And though even Griffin himself did not yet understand it then, the moment that woman pushed his money back toward him had quietly reshaped everything that would come between them, planting inside a man who believed every feeling in him had gone numb a seed of curiosity he would later find impossible to tear out. Griffin was still standing in silence before that bewildering refusal when one of his men hurried in from the street, leaned close to his ear, and whispered something in a tense voice. And Penny saw the boss's expressionless face darken in an instant, his jaw tightening, his gray eyes turning storm dark. He turned to her, and this time his voice no longer held its unhurried ease, only the cold urgency of a man who had just realized he was one step too late, as he told her that the people hunting his sister had traced this address, that they knew Calla had been here the night before. And that meant from this moment on, she and her daughter were no longer innocent outsiders, but had become their targets. Penny felt as if the ground had fallen out from under her, because she understood at once what that meant, that the terrifyingly polite men who had knocked on her door the night before would come back, not to ask questions this time, that the force capable of paralyzing her entire street would not hesitate over a single mother and a 6-year-old child if they believed the two of them held a clue. She shook her head frantically, stammering that she could not leave, that she had a shift at 4 o'clock tomorrow morning, that if she missed work she would lose her job, lose her home, lose everything she had struggled so hard to cling to, and the absurd ordinariness of her fear. The way she was worrying about a shift while her life hung by a thread made Griffin go still and look at her, as if he were looking at a creature from a world he had forgotten long ago, a world where people worried about loose change instead of lines between life and death. He told her in a voice that allowed no argument that she did not understand who she was up against, that if she stayed here one more night, no shift, no roof, would matter anymore, because there would be no one left alive to care about them, and that the only way to keep her and her daughter safe was to come with him to a place no one would dare set foot in. Penny was still hesitating, torn between the fear of stepping into his world and the fear of staying here to wait for death, when Bertie, who had been pressed against her mother's leg holding Cormac's candy, began to gasp for breath. The child's breathing came in a faint wheeze, then grew heavier, her small chest rising and falling too quickly, her little shoulders tightening as she struggled to pull in each breath, and Penny immediately dropped to her knees beside her daughter, digging frantically through her worn purse for the familiar inhaler. But when she shook it in her hand, the hollow, weightless sound made her heart drop, because it was almost empty, only a few doses left, and she had planned to wait until her next paycheck before daring to buy a new one because the medicine was far beyond what she could afford. She gave the child one puff, rubbing her back while whispering the familiar words of comfort, counting each breath until the rhythm eased a little. But the fear inside her did not ease at all, because she knew the tiny amount of medicine left would not last long, and if her life was about to be swept into a storm she could not predict, then the most fragile thing, the thing she feared losing most, was the breath of this little girl. Griffin stood watching the entire scene in silence, his eyes resting on the child's bluish face, before moving to the nearly empty inhaler in the mother's hand. And something passed very quickly through the depths of those cold gray eyes. Something even he could not name, before he turned to his men and ordered in a decisive voice that they prepare the car, take both mother and daughter at once, and see that the child got everything she needed. The Vance estate stood hidden behind towering iron gates in the hills of Sewickley Heights. A stately stone house with long endless corridors, and a kind of elegant silence so refined it felt almost chilling, and as the car carrying the two of them rolled over the gravel drive, Penny held Bertie tightly in her arms, feeling smaller and more out of place than ever, in a world she had never even dared to imagine. Yet where adults might have felt suffocated, a 6-year-old child felt no fear at all, because the moment she was set down on the gleaming marble floor of the front hall, Bertie lifted her head and looked around with wide, curious eyes, then skipped over to a huge bodyguard standing watch by the staircase, and asked in her innocent little voice whether he was a real giant. The broad-shouldered man, who was used to orders and violence, awkwardly lowered his gaze to the tiny creature tugging at the edge of his coat, and the hard line of his mouth unexpectedly softened into a bashful smile that he likely had not known in a very long time. Before long, Bertie had made a full round of the entrance hall, cheerfully chatting with each grim, silent man, carrying a gun beneath his suit jacket, asking them their names, showing off her worn stuffed animal, and in some strange way, the pure, careless brightness of the little girl moved through that cold stone palace like a warm breeze, softening faces that were usually expressionless, prompting a few of them to slip her a piece of candy or gently pat her head when they thought no one was watching. Penny stood at a distance watching her daughter, her heart tightening with fear, even as it filled with a tenderness too deep to name, because in a place so full of danger, her child still possessed the gift of seeing the human being inside men the rest of the world could only find frightening. Griffin quietly observed the entire scene from the far end of the hall, his eyes following the child as she managed to melt the hearts of his most battle-hardened men, and something very faint stirred inside the chest he had long believed had gone cold. Without saying a word, he summoned his private physician, a calm older man carrying a worn leather case, and instructed him to examine Bertie thoroughly. Penny started to protest, started to say that she had no money to pay for such a service, but Griffin only cast her a brief glance, a glance so short and spare yet enough to make her understand that this was not about money, and then he turned away, as if the matter did not deserve another thought. The doctor examined the child with quiet kindness, listened to the rise and fall of her small lungs, asked Penny how long Bertie had suffered from asthma, and by that very afternoon, someone had been sent out and returned, not with one inhaler, but with an entire box of brand new ones still sealed, along with a high-quality nebulizer, and enough backup medication that for years Penny had only ever dared to stare at such things through the glass counter of a pharmacy, before silently turning away. When her trembling hands closed around all those medicines, the invisible burden that had pressed on her chest for so many years, that constant fear that one night her daughter would have an attack, and she would have nothing in her hands to save her, suddenly eased a little, and she had to bite her lip to keep from crying in front of strangers. She went looking for Griffin to thank him, but he had already slipped away, as though he were deliberately avoiding her gratitude, as though even he did not know how to face the kindness he had just shown. And standing in that unfamiliar hallway with the box of medicine in her arms, Penny suddenly realized that the cold, ruthless man she had met that morning might not be wholly evil after all, that somewhere deep beneath all that ice there still remained a fragment of human warmth, that the harsh world he lived in had not yet managed to kill completely. That evening, after Bertie had fallen deeply asleep in the warm, spacious guest room, her breathing steady thanks to the new medicine, Calla knocked softly on Penny's door and took her hand, leading her down the quiet corridors, saying she wanted to show Penny a place. She stopped before a dark wooden door at the end of the west hallway, pushed it gently open, and inside was a small study covered in a thin layer of time-worn dust, a room it seemed no one had entered for a very long while, with bookshelves stretching all the way to the ceiling, a faded velvet armchair, and on the walnut writing desk, a framed photograph of a gentle woman with kind eyes. Calla said softly that this had been her mother's room, Marlene's room, that she had passed away many years before, and that neither Griffin nor Calla came in here much because, for her brother, this room brought back too many things he did not want to remember. Through the girl's choked voice, Penny slowly came to understand the dark missing piece in this family's past, that their father had died in a terrible tragedy when Griffin was only 19, forcing a young man who had suddenly lost his primary support to brace himself, protect his ailing mother, and carry both an empire full of hatred and a baby sister still barely out of infancy. Calla added that their mother, Marlene, had only passed away 3 years ago after a long illness, spent mostly in seclusion, forced to learn how to become hard enough to be cruel, just so the two of them could survive among wolves, waiting to tear apart everything their parents had left behind. Penny stood silent before that story, beginning to understand why that man's eyes were so cold, why he had built such a thick wall of ice around himself. Because how could a boy who had buried his parents and then raised his little sister with his own hands in the middle of danger still keep the softness of his heart untouched? Then Calla's voice sank lower, her shoulders trembling, and in the dimness of the room she poured out the burden that had been crushing her for days, confessing that everything that had happened was her own fault. She said that after the threats began, Griffin had hidden her in a discreet, safe place, closely guarded, telling her over and over that no matter what happened she must not step outside. But she had felt too suffocated, too exhausted by those walls that imprisoned her in the name of protection, and in one reckless moment of wanting to breathe a little freedom, she had slipped out, only to fall straight into the hands of the men lying in wait. She sobbed that her own selfish foolishness had put everyone in danger, had dragged innocent Penny and Bertie into this storm, that if she had only listened to her brother, no one would have had to suffer because of her. Penny held the girl, soothing that shaking back, and with all the tenderness of a mother, she said that wanting freedom was not a sin, that at 19 everyone had moments when they wanted to break loose from the ropes around them, that the people to blame were the ones who had used that innocence to hurt her, not Calla herself. A few nights later, the Vance estate glowed with a kind of light entirely different from its usual stillness, because Griffin was forced to host a gathering of the families, a meeting that in his world carried life or death meaning, meant to reassure the partners and allies unsettled after his sister's kidnapping, to prove that the Vance house still stood firm, still held everything under control, that no crack was deep enough to shake their empire. Calla pleaded with Penny for so long that Penny finally agreed to appear, and to hide her true identity from watchful eyes, Griffin arranged for her to enter as a guest, a distant acquaintance of the family, not as the witness from that fateful night. Makeup artists and maids dressed Penny in a perfectly fitted black evening gown, her hair swept up in an elegant knot, and when she stood before the tall mirror and looked at her own reflection, for one moment she almost did not recognize that woman, a woman who seemed to possess a quiet beauty and dignity that years spent buried between two shifts had never given her a chance to see. But that rare feeling of loveliness vanished almost the moment she stepped into the glittering great hall, because among people who belonged to this world, ladies wrapped in silk and jewels, gentlemen in expensive formal wear, speaking and laughing in the language of power and money, Penny at once felt out of place, like an imposter waiting to be exposed, her work-roughened hands quickly hidden behind her back, every gesture cautious and awkward amid a crowd that knew every rule she did not. She stood tucked beside a column, trying to make herself as small as possible, wishing only for the evening to pass quickly, when an older man separated himself from the crowd and came toward her with the kindest smile she had seen in the entire room. His white hair was carefully combed, his manner stately and benevolent like a respected patron, and he introduced himself as Walter Price, an old family friend, a reputable legitimate business partner, and a man even more widely known for his charitable projects throughout the region. He shook Penny's hand with both warm hands, kindly asked where she came from, complimented her for having a rare, honest beauty among all these glittering false people, and spoke with such genuine warmth that Penny, adrift in that sea of cold strangers, found herself unexpectedly relieved and grateful, as if someone here had finally treated her like a human being. She noticed that wherever Walter Price went, other powerful people bowed their heads respectfully, that even the hardest faces opened into deferential smiles when he came near, and she quietly thought that a man so honored by everyone, and yet kind to someone as ordinary as her, must be a rare good man. Yet, even as she felt touched by his kindness, the hard-earned survival instincts of a woman who had spent her entire life protecting herself kept her guarded. While he thoughtfully poured her a glass of water and listened with gentle attention, Penny quietly slipped her hand into her clutch bag and turned on the recorder on her old phone, never fully trusting anyone in this dangerous world, unwittingly capturing the subtle slips of the man, who was actually the coldest mind in the room, and the very mastermind spreading the net to swallow them all, and that the trust she had silently given him tonight would become one of the costliest mistakes she would later pay for in blood and tears. Across the great hall, Griffin saw Walter Price speaking intimately with Penny, and though his face did not change, something in his eyes darkened slightly, a faint instinct he had not yet had time to name. That rare pleasant conversation had not yet truly made Penny feel at ease when another voice cut in, smooth and cold as a blade, belonging to a man a little over 50, with slicked back hair and narrow eyes full of contempt. A man Penny would later learn was named August Finch, the longtime advisor and supposedly one of the most trusted hands of the Vance family. He took a sip of wine, let his eyes travel over Penny from head to toe, with the look of someone examining an object set down where it did not belong, then spoke loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear, mocking that he did not understand when formal family gatherings had begun opening their doors to diner waitresses, that he had thought Griffin had brought home an honored guest, not picked someone up from the sidewalk, simply to fill an empty seat. A few soft laughs rose around them, the half-smiles of people always ready to follow the strongest voice, and Penny felt her cheeks burn with the familiar sting of humiliation, a taste she had known too many times in her life, from rude customers at the diner to the contemptuous looks the world gave a poor single mother. For one moment, she almost lowered her head and swallowed the insult the way she always had, almost made herself smaller and waited for the storm of words to pass. But then something inside her rose up, the steel in her forged through countless long nights of calming drunken arguments at 3 o'clock in the morning, through countless times standing straight before people who believed poverty meant weakness. She lifted her head, looked directly at August Finch, and in a voice calm but clear enough to carry through the room, she answered that yes, she was only a diner waitress, but at least when a life was bleeding at her door, she had not turned away and left it there, which she was afraid might not be true of everyone in this elegant room. Then she continued, slowly and sharply, saying that she found it strange that an entire powerful family, with so many guards and so many men swearing loyalty, had somehow allowed the master's sister to be taken by enemies right under its own protection, and that if she were the one sitting in the position of most trusted advisor, perhaps instead of worrying about who had been invited to a party, she would be asking how those enemies knew the family's every move so clearly, how they were always one step ahead, because a wolf outside the woods could not possibly know the way into the pen by heart unless someone inside had already opened the gate for it. The moment her words ended, the great hall fell into a silence, so deep the faint clink of wineglasses could be heard, and then stopped, because no one had expected the ordinary woman, made into a joke, to dare speak aloud what all of them had secretly been thinking, but none had dared to say. The aching suspicion that the traitor had not come from outside, but was hiding among them. August Finch's face went pale, then flushed red with anger, and something else passed very quickly through the depths of his eyes, a flash of panic that only someone truly observant could catch, and he sputtered as if to answer, but for the moment could find no words worthy of saying. Standing among the stunned crowd, Walter Price lifted one eyebrow at Penny with a new interest, reassessing the woman he had only just assumed was a harmless pawn, while at the far end of the room, Griffin Vance, who had witnessed it all, allowed the faintest smile to touch the corner of his mouth, the first smile anyone there had ever seen on the icy face of the boss. That heavy silence lasted only a moment before August Finch could no longer hold back the fury bursting inside him, because for a man used to being feared within the family, being exposed in front of a crowd by a diner waitress was an unforgivable humiliation, and he strode toward Penny, his face twisted with rage, his hand lifting in a threatening gesture as he hissed warnings that she did not know who she was daring to speak to, that something like her should know her place and keep her mouth shut. Penny did not step back. She stood there with her head held high, facing that storm of anger, but before that hateful hand could touch her, a figure moved in between them, so swift and silent that the room only realized what had happened after it was already done. Griffin Vance stood there, between Penny and his advisor, and he did not raise his voice, did not strike. He only took Finch's raised wrist in a grip so calm it was chilling, but the force radiating from him in that moment froze the entire great hall, turning August Finch himself pale and rigid inside the iron clamp of the boss's hand. In a low, even voice, each word as heavy as stone, Griffin said that this woman was under his protection, that from this moment forward, anyone in the room who touched her, even with a single contemptuous word, would answer directly to him, and that he hoped he would not have to repeat himself ever again. He released Finch's hand and flicked the man's wrist down as if brushing away something filthy, then swept his cold gray gaze around the hall, stopping on each breathless face, silently daring anyone to object, and no one did. In the world Griffin Vance ruled, his word was law, and for the boss to publicly place an ordinary woman under his protection before all the families was a shocking declaration, something without precedent, making the powerful people gathered around them look at Penny with entirely different eyes, no longer with contempt, but with wary astonishment before the mysterious woman who had made the coldest king step forward himself. August Finch stood rooted in place, his face flushing red, then going pale, his pride trampled and hatred boiling inside his chest. But he was forced to swallow all of it, awkwardly bowing his head and muttering a few words of apology before slipping back into the crowd. And only the venomous look he threw at Penny, in the final instant, revealed that this grudge was far from over, that he would remember the shame of this night and wait for the day he could repay it. Penny stood still behind Griffin, her heart pounding, partly from the fear that had just passed, but far more from an unfamiliar feeling rising within her, the feeling that for the first time in her life, someone had been willing to stand between her and the whole world, not because she was useful, not because she was beautiful or noble, but seemingly because she herself deserved to be protected. When Griffin turned back to look at her, for one brief moment the ice on his face seemed to thaw, revealing something almost like tenderness that even he hurried to hide, and then he only asked quietly whether she wanted to leave this noisy crowd and get some air outside. Penny, still shaken, silently nodded and placed her hand on the arm he offered, while hundreds of eyes followed every step they took. Griffin led her out onto a broad stone balcony, overlooking the garden swallowed by darkness, where the music and false courtesies of the great hall reached them only as a muffled echo behind the glass doors. And there, beneath a night sky scattered with a few faint stars, two people from two worlds set far apart stood beside each other in a strange silence that did not feel awkward at all. Griffin rested his hands on the stone railing, his eyes fixed on the far darkness, and after a long while, in a low, rough voice entirely different from the cold authority he wore before everyone else, he quietly said that it had been a very long time since anyone had looked at him the way she looked at him. That, in his world, people either feared him, or wanted what he had, or waited for one careless opening to stab him in the back, but no one had ever simply looked at him as a human being. He confessed that from the day he buried his parents at 19, he had learned not to allow himself to trust anyone, had built a wall around his heart with his own hands so he would never have to taste that pain of loss again, and that the price of the power he held was an absolute loneliness that felt cold to the bone, even while hundreds of people praised his name. Penny listened, and then she too softly told him about her life, about the husband who had left her with a pile of debt and a child, about the long nights working 2 shifts until her body nearly gave out, about the feeling of becoming invisible in the eyes of the world, looked down upon simply because she was poor, simply because she was a woman alone, with nothing in her hands but love for her daughter. And she said she understood that feeling of being lonely in a crowd better than anyone, even though her world and his were separated by an entire sky. In that moment, 2 wounds from 2 people who seemed to have nothing in common suddenly touched, and both of them understood that loneliness was the same whether a person was rich or poor, that behind the icy armor of the boss and behind the stained uniform of the waitress were 2 hearts both longing for someone to truly see them. That night, after walking Penny back to her room, Griffin went alone to his mother's old study, the room he had avoided for years, and as if pushed by something he could not explain, He picked up Marlene's worn leather journal and turned through the yellowed pages, covered in the familiar handwriting of his late mother. Then he stopped on a page written just 3 years before, reading again and again the lines his mother had written about one of the darkest afternoons of her final years, when she had slipped away from her guards and sat alone in a small diner in Millvale, drained and desperate, and a young waitress had quietly brought her a cup of hot tea, sat down to listen to her, comforted her with sincere kindness that wanted nothing in return. A small goodness, his mother wrote, that she would carry with her for the rest of her life and prayed she might one day repay. Griffin read the diner's name, read the details his mother had described about that young woman, and his hand trembled faintly as the pieces inside his mind began fitting together, as he realized that the woman who had saved his sister, the woman who had refused his money, the woman who had just stood beside him on the balcony and seen through his loneliness, was the kind girl from years ago in his mother's journal. He sank down into the old armchair, the journal pressed against his chest, and for the first time in many years, the cold gray eyes of the notorious boss blurred with tears, because he understood that this could not be mere coincidence, that somehow, in some miraculous way, his late mother had led the warm-hearted woman into her son's frozen life. In the days after that night, something warm began to slip into the cold estate. Griffin started spending more time with Penny and Bertie. Calla laughed more often, and Penny gradually let go of her caution enough to believe that perhaps this place was truly safe, that perhaps the people around her were not entirely as frightening as she had once thought. She was especially fond of Cormac, the gray-haired older guard who was always gentle with her daughter, who slipped Bertie a piece of candy every morning, who patiently sat and listened to the little girl tell her wandering, endless stories, and who treated mother and child with the tenderness of a kind grandfather in a world filled with hard stone faces. In Penny's heart, Cormac was the safest support, the only person in this place who felt familiar, and that was precisely why she could never have imagined what was coming. Late one night, while Griffin was still sitting alone in the study with his mother's journal, and his thoughts about the woman who had shaken his frozen heart, the door opened softly, and Cormac stepped in with his usual calm manner, carrying a tray of tea the way he often did. Griffin had no guard up against the man who had served the family for decades, who had once held him in his arms when he was still small, who had stood beside him on the day he buried his parents, and that absolute trust became the fatal opening. When Griffin bent to take the cup of tea, Cormac drew a pistol fitted with a suppressor from inside his coat, and in that same gentle, chillingly composed voice, he said softly that he was sorry, that this was nothing personal, only that he had chosen to stand with the one who would win. The shot was pressed into a dry, dull sound in the empty night, and Griffin staggered and fell, one side of his chest blooming red, his gray eyes wide with pain and with utter shock at the face of the man he had trusted all his life. That betrayal hurt more than the bullet itself, because it had come from the very hand that had once guided him, from the person he had regarded as the last remaining piece of family, from the time when his parents were still alive. Cormac coldly stepped over the fallen body of the boss, the false kindness in his eyes now replaced by real cruelty, and moved toward the hallway leading to Calla's room, because his mission that night was not only to bring Griffin down, but to take his sister once again. But the muffled sound and the shattering of the teacup against the stone floor woke Penny in the nearby room, and the instinct of a mother who had always lived alert made her jolt upright, throw on a coat, and rush into the hallway. The sight that struck her eyes made her freeze. Griffin collapsed beside a spreading pool of blood beneath the weak golden light of the study, while Cormac, the kind man in whom she had placed all her trust, stood there with a gun in his hand, and a face so strange and terrifying she had never seen it before. In that moment, the whole world seemed to fall apart around Penny, not only because she was witnessing a man dying before her eyes, but because she realized that the trust she had given in this place had been betrayed in the cruelest way, that kindness could sometimes be only a mask worn to hide the darkest schemes, and that now, standing in the dark hallway with a cold-blooded killer before her, and a life fading at her feet, she was the only one left who could do anything at all. The moment Cormac turned toward the hallway leading to Calla's room, his eyes briefly slid to Penny standing frozen at the threshold, and that cold, calculating look made her understand that he would not leave any witness alive, that she and even her daughter were now on the list of things to be cleaned away before the night was over. But Penny was no longer the woman who only knew how to lower her head and endure, because inside her now rose the oldest and fiercest instinct of all, the instinct of a mother willing to do anything to protect her child. And the long years of standing behind the diner counter late at night, learning to keep a cool head when fights broke out among drunk customers right in front of her, had taught her that in a crisis, the person who hesitated was the one who lost. Her eyes swept quickly around the room and stopped on a heavy bronze statue, sitting on a small table by the door, and before fear could hold her back, she grabbed it with both hands and rushed him from behind, just as Cormac stepped over the threshold. With all her weight and all her desperation, she brought the object down, and the large man staggered, collapsing forward as the gun flew from his hand and skidded across the stone floor. Cormac did not fall completely at once. He managed to twist around and seize Penny's wrist, and in the violent struggle that followed, a knife hidden on him cut a line across her arm, the sharp pain flaring through her and making her cry out, but she did not let go. Gritting her teeth, she gathered every bit of strength she had left and shoved him backward into the edge of the table, and that hard impact finally sent the traitor to the floor, motionless. Gasping for breath, blood soaking into her sleeve, Penny quickly kicked the gun away, then turned back toward Griffin, but just then a terrified scream rang out from the end of the hallway and made her heart seem to stop. Bertie, woken by the chaos, had left her bed and was standing pressed against the wall at the safe bend of the corridor, far from any direct danger, but her child's eyes had already witnessed the frightening scene, and the terror made her small chest begin to heave in rapid, desperate breaths. Penny knew at once that fear had triggered her daughter's asthma, and though her own arm was bleeding, though her heart felt ready to break with worry for Griffin, she ran to her child first, dropped to her knees, and pulled her into her arms, using her own body to block Bertie's view of the room behind them. In the gentle voice that had soothed her through so many breathless nights, she whispered for Bertie to look into her mother's eyes, to breathe with her slowly, in and out, that Mama was here now, that she was safe now, and she reached for the inhaler she always carried, gave her one dose, and patiently stroked her back until that panicked breathing gradually softened, until the little girl's shoulders stopped shaking. Only when she was certain her daughter was all right, when she had called for a trusted maid to take Bertie back to the room and stay with her to comfort her, did Penny allow herself to return to the man lying motionless in a pool of blood, and, as she sank to her knees beside Griffin with trembling hands, she knew that the battle to keep him alive had only truly begun. Kneeling beside Griffin, Penny immediately did what instinct and experience told her to do, because for a long time she had once worked extra shifts at a nursing home, where she had learned basic first aid skills, and more than once had been forced to stay calm in desperate moments. She tore the hem of her nightgown, folded it into a thick pad, and pressed it hard against the bleeding wound in his chest, putting all the weight of her body into her hands to stop the blood that kept flowing, never once stopping as she called his name, telling him to hold on, to open his eyes and look at her, not to let go. Calla had also come running in, her face drained of all color when she saw her brother lying there, and Penny fought to keep her voice calm as she ordered the girl to call. The person Griffin trusted most at once, because they both understood that calling an ambulance or the police now would be no different from handing him and the entire family over to their enemies, that in Griffin's world, a gunshot wound would bring questions no one was allowed to answer. Only a few minutes later, the private doctor who had examined Bertie arrived with a large case full of mobile medical equipment, the kind of tools families like the Vances always kept ready for nights like this, and he quickly knelt to take over, checking the wound and replacing Penny's hands to maintain pressure. But the doctor's face grew more and more tense when he realized Griffin had lost too much blood, his pulse weakening, and he said in a low voice that Griffin needed a transfusion immediately or he would not survive, that he had brought equipment for a direct blood transfusion. But the problem was Griffin had a rare blood type, and among the people present there was no one certain to be compatible in time. Hearing that, Penny suddenly went still, a distant memory flashing through her mind, because there had been a time when she had been so desperate for money to care for her child that she had gone to donate blood, and she still remembered clearly the nurse telling her that she had a very rare blood type, that her blood was precious, and they always hoped she would come back. Her heart pounding, she quickly told him her blood type, and when the doctor snapped his head up to look at her with eyes filled with both astonishment and the sudden discovery of one last hope, confirming that it matched, Penny did not hesitate for a single second before offering him her uninjured arm and telling him to take her blood, as much as he needed, as long as it saved Griffin. The doctor hesitated briefly, as he looked at the wound still seeping blood on her other arm, but before the determination in that woman's eyes, he nodded, and quickly set up the line that joined the two of them together. Penny lay down beside Griffin on the cold floor, feeling each warm drop of her life force flowing into him to replace the life draining from his body. And though her own body slowly weakened, her mind growing light from both the fluid she had lost through her arm and the crimson she was now giving away, she still held tightly to his cold hand, whispering in his ear that she was here, that she would not let him leave, that he had to live, not for her, but for the sister who still needed him, and for all the good things she believed were still hidden deep inside this man who seemed so ruthless. After Penny's warm blood had been flowing into him for a while, and color slowly began returning to Griffin's pale face, his eyelids stirred, then opened little by little, and the first thing those gray eyes saw was the woman lying on the floor right beside him, her face bloodless with exhaustion, one arm wrapped in a bandage stained with blood while the other was connected to him by a fragile transfusion line. It took him a moment to understand what was happening, and when he realized that she was giving him her own blood to save him, even though she herself was injured, an emotion he had long believed he had lost suddenly rose inside his chest, making his voice rough as he struggled to tell her to stop, to pull the needle out at once. He said in broken breaths that she must not do this, that she had been bleeding, that she had a little daughter who needed her, that she owed him nothing, that required her to risk her health and safety like this, and that he would rather accept his own fate than let her put herself in danger one more time because of him. This was something no one had ever seen in Griffin Vance. A man used to ordering others to sacrifice for him, used to treating the lives of his men like pieces on a board, and yet now, weak and wounded, the only thing he cared about was the safety of a woman who had once been a stranger, and in the very moment he placed her life above his own, the last layer of ice that had wrapped around his heart for so many years truly began to crack. Penny only tightened her hold on his hand, smiling even though her lips had gone pale, and in a voice soft but unshakably firm, she answered that he had once told her she was a strong woman, so now he should let her be strong for both of them, let her carry the part he could not carry for himself, because that was what it truly meant to have someone beside you. She said that all her life she had been used to giving, without expecting anything in return, used to fighting everything alone, and that saving him tonight was not a debt or an exchange, but simply because she could not stand by and watch a human being she had begun to care for, fade away before her eyes. Those words blurred Griffin's eyes, and he no longer had the strength to resist. He only held her hand in silence and let her blood continue flowing into him, feeding life back into his body, and in the sacred quiet of the room, where only the soft sound of medical equipment remained, two people from opposite worlds lay beside each other, joined in a way no words could ever fully explain. The doctor quietly continued his work. Calla stood near the door wiping away tears, and all of them could feel that something had changed forever inside the notorious boss, that the man who had once built an entire empire on fear and ruthlessness had finally learned the one thing power and money had never been able to buy him, the meaning of being loved unconditionally, and both the cost and the preciousness of daring to love someone in return. Griffin was still recovering, his strength not yet fully restored, when disaster struck again from a direction no one had expected, because August Finch, after his assassination attempt failed and knowing he had been exposed, decided to make his final move by striking at Penny's weakest place. He sent men to the old diner in Millvale and took Hank, the kind old cook who had worked with Penny for so many years, the man who always saved her a hot meal on the nights she finished late and had never once spoken a cruel word to her. A phone call came that turned Penny's blood cold. August Finch's smooth, poisonous voice sounding through the line, telling her that he was holding an old friend of hers, that if she still cared about the people who belonged to her old life, about the peace of everyone she loved, then she should persuade Griffin to meet him, alone, at an abandoned warehouse by the Monongahela River harbor. He did not threaten the child directly, but the way he lingered over the words, saying how unfortunate it would be if the peace of a small family were shattered, that he knew Penny still had things more precious than her own life, was enough to plant a cold terror inside her, because she understood exactly what he was implying. When Griffin learned of it, though his body had not healed, he still decided he had to face it, that he could not let innocent people suffer any longer because of his war, and he and the men still loyal to him quietly prepared for the raid on the warehouse where Finch had set his trap. Penny insisted on going with him despite Griffin's attempts to stop her, since Hank had been targeted solely because of her, and she could not hide behind someone else, while a good friend was in danger for her sake. When the group closed in on the dark, deserted warehouse beside the river at night, a tense gunfight broke out between Griffin's men and Finch's people, hiding behind stacked crates, bursts of gunfire cracking sharply through the hollow space of the warehouse. Penny crouched behind an iron pillar, her heart pounding, her eyes searching wildly for any sign of Hank amid the chaos. At last, when Griffin cornered Finch and held him at gunpoint, forcing him to surrender, the traitorous advisor broke into a shrill, deranged laugh, and in that desperate moment, he let slip the truth that had been hidden for so long. He hissed that Griffin really was an arrogant fool, that he had thought he was fighting some ordinary traitor, when in truth he, August Finch, was only a sacrificial pawn, that the one pulling every string from beginning to end, the one who had planned Calla's kidnapping, the one who had bought Cormac, the one who truly wanted to swallow the entire Vance network, was none other than Walter Price. He laughed wildly as he said Price had grown tired of the bloody underworld, that he wanted to seize the whole Vance empire and turn it into a clean and legal form of power, wearing the robe of a respected philanthropist while still holding everything in his hands, and that the benevolent man who had kindly poured a glass of water for Penny at the party was the most dangerous monster she had ever faced. That confession sent a chill down Penny's spine as she remembered Walter Price's gentle smile and warm hands, and she suddenly understood that the true enemy was not the man holding a gun in the dark, but the one always smiling beneath the lights. It turned out that Finch's capture was only the beginning of the real war, because Walter Price did not need bullets to destroy Griffin. He possessed a weapon far more frightening, connections with public officials, and a legal machinery he had carefully built beneath the mask of a respected philanthropist. Only a few days later, Price began spreading his net, secretly arranging for every crime, every piece of illegal evidence, to point toward Griffin, using his influence to turn Griffin into the one who would take the fall, while he calmly stepped in to take over everything, clean and spotless in the eyes of the law. But Walter Price completely underestimated the woman he had looked down on as a helpless pawn. When Griffin was in danger of being framed, Penny stepped forward and handed him the old phone from that fateful night, containing the secret recording of Price's own careless admissions. Combined with the additional evidence she had quietly gathered in the days that followed, it drew a complete, undeniable picture of the true mastermind. Standing at the most important crossroads of his life, Griffin Vance did something the old version of himself never would have done. He chose not to answer Price with blood and violence the way the underworld had always worked, but accepted a great risk by entering a conditional alliance with a female federal investigator who had been quietly watching Price for a long time, but had never had enough evidence. The evidence Penny had collected became the missing link. Within a short time, Walter Price's benevolent mask was stripped away in the light. His seemingly spotless empire collapsed. Those who had once bowed to him in fearful respect turned and ran, and even August Finch, when he realized his hidden master's time was over, was abandoned by his own faction. More important than all of it, that choice marked Griffin's first step away from the world of shadows that had imprisoned him for his entire life, beginning a journey of cleansing himself so he could become worthy of the woman who had taught him that true strength did not lie in making others afraid, but in having the courage to live decently. 1 month later, after every storm had settled, a luxurious car stopped in front of the old diner in Millvale, and Penny stepped out, no longer wearing the stained uniform from those old years, but an elegant red coat, carrying the calm, confident bearing of a woman who had found her own worth again. the regular customer who had once spoken cruelly to her, and the landlord who had once bullied her both went pale when they saw the powerful man walking silently beside her. But Penny did not need that power to take revenge, because what she did was far greater than that. Griffin had bought that very diner, not to show off, but to place it in Penny's hands, to give her full authority over her own life, and she transformed the place that had once witnessed so much of her humiliation into a warm home. A place ready to offer work opportunities to vulnerable people society had turned away from. Single mothers, people who had made mistakes and wanted to begin again. People who needed an outstretched hand just as she once had. Birdie was now healthy, running and laughing freely with steady breath, no longer tormented by asthma attacks. Calla had found her laughter again and saw Penny as a sister, as a second mother. And Griffin, the man who had once been lonely inside an empire of fear, truly had a family for the first time in his life, a place to return to, a heart to love and be loved by in return. Penny Hollister's story reminds us of something simple yet profound, that the value of a human being is never measured by money, status, or appearance, but by the kindness brave enough to reach out and save a stranger, by the courage to stand tall and demand the respect one deserves, and that sometimes the very people the world looks down on most carry within them the noblest hearts and the strength to change even destinies that seem beyond saving. The kindness we give today, no matter how small, can become a guiding light for someone in the darkest days of their life, and no sincere act of love is ever meaningless. If this story has touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, press the like button, and share this video so we can spread meaningful stories together and bring you many more compelling stories every day. How do you feel about Penny and Griffin's story?